How are you guys doing? Today is Friday, May 13th, 2022. I'm James Sims, and for this episode of The Elite, I'm going to do an elite individual profile on Tyrann Mathieu. The elite safety for the New Orleans Saints is now 29, as he's actually from New Orleans, and before he plays for his hometown team for his first season playing there, I'm going to give this profile for what Tyrann Mathieu has done with his career up until his 29th birthday to give you a sense of how elite Tyrann Mathieu is on a micro level when you get a sense of what he does for his team game in and game out. And of course, I'm going to look out on a macro level and look at how Tyrann Mathieu, with his build and how he plays the game, has at least changed or at least shaped the NFL into what we see it right now. So if you're not familiar with Tyrann Mathieu, he stands at about 5'9". He's 190 pounds playing safety. He's more like a bowling ball in the way that he plays, and that he's able to generate so much speed and force. And he's just so technically sound with how he tackles and how he wraps up and brings people down. I think that he is a prototypical safety, a hybrid safety in the sense where you can kind of plug him in. You can put him on the line. You can have him blitz. You can have him drop back and play coverage. Tyrann Mathieu is kind of a player that you can kind of have everywhere, and his feistiness is why he has the nickname the Honey Badger. He was a player that, of course, was known for being this type of player before he even got to the NFL. He had gotten his Honey Badger nickname in the SEC after he had forced 11 career fumbles for LSU. After playing high school football in New Orleans, he would go on and get recruited to play at LSU. He would go on to play at LSU starting in his 2010 season, playing for Les Miles as a true freshman. He only started one of the 13 games he played, and this was all in a season in which LSU would go on to finish with an 11-2 record. They would make it all the way to the Cotton Bowl, and in the Cotton Bowl, they would go on to beat Texas A&M in that game. In Tyrann Mathieu's freshman season as a collegiate defensive back, he would go on to finish with 57 tackles. He had 8.5 tackles for loss, 4.5 sacks, even 2 interceptions. In his freshman season, he would go on to force 5 fumbles, even recovering 3, like he was a force to be reckoned with as a freshman. And following that season, he would go on to return for his second season with LSU, as his second season with LSU would go on to be his age 19 season. In that year, he would go on to start all 13 games for an LSU Tigers team that eventually will go all the way to the BCS National Championship game just to lose 11-0 to Alabama. But in the regular season, Tyrann Mathieu would, of course, go on to be named to the first team SEC, consensus All-American, SEC Defensive Player of the Year, all of that. In that season, as a sophomore, he finished with 76 tackles, nearly 20 more than he had as a freshman. He would go on to finish with 7.5 tackles for loss. He had a sack and a half, which was 3 less than his freshman year. He would go on to finish with 2 interceptions, just like the previous year. He finished with 6 forced fumbles. That's 11 forced fumbles in his underclassmen years at LSU. He would go on to recover 5 fumbles, making it 8 for his career, and he picked up 2 fumble recovery touchdowns that year. And following that 2011 season, he, of course, was recognized as one of the best college football players. He would go on to be dismissed from the team in his junior year after he had violated team rules, after he had repeatedly failed some drug tests. However, he would go on to enter the NFL draft after his eligibility was up. He would go on to, of course, have a really good combine. And despite not playing his junior year, he would still go on to be taken in the 2013 draft. He was taken in the 3rd round with the 69th overall pick. And just looking at just who was in that draft, the top safety in that draft was Kenny Vaccaro, drafted by the New Orleans Saints out of Texas. Eric Reed would also be drafted in that round too. Those are the top safety. Even Matt Elam, there were 3 safeties taken in the first round of that draft that year. But he would go on and fall to the Arizona Cardinals, as the Cardinals were the first team to pick him up. And starting out for the Arizona Cardinals, of course, he would show why he was that Honey Badger player, why he was the Honey Badger in the SEC. Tyrann Mathieu's first season in Arizona was his age 21 season in 2013. He would go on to start 11 of the 13 games he played in a season where the Cardinals would finish with a 10-6 record in Bruce Arians' first season as coach. They had won 5 more games in the previous season, but they still somehow went on to miss the playoffs. In Tyrann Mathieu's rookie season, he would go on to finish with about 68 tackles. He would go on to finish with a sack on the season, 6 tackles for loss. He would finish with a forced fumble in his rookie season as well. Not to mention, he also had 2 interceptions. So he was really kind of in the mix, doing it all. But following that 2013 season, he would go on to make the all-rookie team, but the Cardinals would fail to make the playoffs. This would transition into Mathieu's second season with the team. In his age 22 season, he would go on to start 6 of the 13 games he played, as he was still going on to fight for a starting spot. And he was injured in training. He wasn't able to participate in training camp because he would go on to recover from his injury where he had tore his ACL and MCL in his rookie season, but he would still go on to play the 13 games he played. In the 13 games he played, he would go on to finish with 38 tackles, 2 tackles for loss, and he would go on to finish with an interception even for the year. However, once the season came to an end, the Cardinals would go on to make the playoffs that year, and Coach Bruce Arians would go on to be named the Coach of the Year. They would go on to lose in the wild card round to the Panthers, however, but this would transition into Tyrann's third season with the Cardinals. In his age 23 season in 2015, that was the year he kind of turned a lot of heads, where he would go on to be named to the first team All-NFL that year. In his very first Pro Bowl season in 2015, Tyrann Mathieu would start all 14 of the games he played for an Arizona Cardinals team that would end up going 13-3, winning the NFC West after they had clinched the playoffs finally the year before. In 2015, Tyrann Mathieu will go on to finish with 89 tackles on the year, which is actually tied for his career high, more than doubling what he did in the previous year. He would finish with 11 tackles for loss, the only season in his career in which he's had a double-digit amount of those. He would finish with a sack, his second of his NFL career. He would go on to force a fumble, and he went on to finish with 5 interceptions, which at that point was a career high for him, the first time he crossed the 5 interceptions threshold. And he would go on to return his first ever pick 6 that year as well. At the end of the year, with the Cardinals making the playoffs, Tyrann Mathieu would go on to be named a Pro Bowler and a first-team All-Pro. And once the Cardinals made the playoffs that year, they would beat the Packers in the divisional round just to lose to the Carolina Panthers in the NFC Championship. And then this, of course, would lead to the Panthers getting housed by the Broncos in the playoffs. But this would go on to be how that series would go on to end. But following that 2015 season, Tyrann Mathieu would return to the Arizona Cardinals for his 4th season in 2016. In that season, he would start all 10 of the games he played in a season where Arizona would go on to finish with a 7-8-1 record. This is the year that Larry Fitzgerald won the Walter Payton Man of the Year. And in 2016, Tyrann Mathieu would go on to fight even more injury, as that year he would go on to pick up a shoulder injury. But in that season, in the 10 games he played, he had 35 tackles, 3 tackles for loss. He even had a sack, his 3rd of his career. He would force a fumble and even record an interception as well. Following that season, of course, Arizona would not go on to make the playoffs. And then following that year, Tyrann Mathieu would return for his 5th and final season in Arizona. In his age 25 season with the team in 2017, he would go on to start all 16 of the games he played, for the first time in his NFL career, by the way, in a season where the Arizona Cardinals would finish with an 8-8 record in Bruce Arians' last season coaching the team. In 2017, Tyrann Mathieu would go on to finish with 78 tackles on the year, second time he at least crossed the 70 tackle threshold. He would finish with a sack, 6 tackles for loss. He would finish with a forced fumble for the 3rd year in a row, and not to mention he would finish with 2 interceptions. Like I said, he was just another player doing it all. And then following that last season at Arizona, he would go on to find himself on the Houston Texans as he signed a 1-year contract worth about $7 million. And this was, of course, after he was released by the Cardinals after refusing to take a pay cut. In his first season with Houston, in his lone season with Houston, Tyrann Mathieu would start all 16 of the games he played in a season where the Houston Texans would go 11-5. This would be the season in which this would be the year after J.J. Watt would win the Walter Payton Man of the Year. But in that season, in that lone season in Houston, Mathieu would finish with 89 tackles on the year. That would actually tie his career high from what he did his third year in Arizona. He would go on to finish with 5 tackles for loss. He even had 3 sacks, which is a career high for him in a completely new system. He would go on to finish with a fumble recovery, and he also had 2 interceptions on the year. Once that season came to a close, the Houston Texans would end up losing in the wild card round to the Colts, as the eventual Super Bowl champions that year would be the Patriots, as the Patriots beat the Rams that year. But following that, Tyrann Mathieu would go on and find himself on the Kansas City Chiefs after signing a 3-year deal with them. And in the first year of his 3-year deal, Tyrann Mathieu would go on to play all 16 games in a season in which he returned back to the first team All-Pro, in a season where the Kansas City Chiefs would finish with a 12-4 record. This was the 3rd year in a row they had won the AFC West, and this was the year after Patrick Mahomes had won the MVP. In that 2019 season, Tyrann Mathieu would finish with 75 tackles on the year. That would be the 3rd year in a row and the 4th time in a 5-year stretch that he had at least crossed the 70 tackle threshold. He had 3 tackles for a loss. He had a couple of sacks. This would be the 2nd year in a row that he had at least 1. He wasn't doing it consistently before then. He would go on to finish with 12 passes defended. The 2nd time in his career he had double digits. And the last time, of course, was 2015. He would go on to finish with 4 interceptions, which would be the 2nd time he's had at least that many in a season. At the end of 2019, he was not named a Pro Bowler, but he was named to the All-Pro first team to give him a sense to being ranked as one of the best players at his position at safety in this league. Once the Kansas City Chiefs would make it into the playoffs this year, they would end up beating the Texans in the divisional round by 20, actually. They would go on to beat the Titans by 11 in the AFC Championship. In 2019, Tyrann Mathieu's first season in Kansas City was the year that they would go on to win the Super Bowl. Tyrann Mathieu would be a very big part of that team, considering he was a first-team All-Pro that year. And following that season, he would go on, I guess going back, they would beat the 49ers. I doubt I mentioned that. They beat the 49ers in Super Bowl 54 by 11. And Tyrann Mathieu was able to take home his lone Super Bowl ring that he has to this date, and he was a very big part of that team that was able to win it. So following his very first season, his title season in Kansas City, he would go on to return for what would be his 8th season in the NFL. And in his 2nd season with Kansas City in 2020, he would start all 15 of the games he played in a season where the Chiefs would go 14-2. This would be the best record that the Chiefs would put up in their history as a franchise. So it'll be a very historic season for them. In his 2nd season there, Tyrann Mathieu would go on to be named to the first team All-Pro, and he was named a Pro Bowler. First time he's had both of those honors since 2015. In that 2020 season, he would go on to finish with 62 combined tackles, which is a little lower than what he had done the years before. He had 3 tackles for loss. Didn't even record a sack. He would go on to record a fumble recovery. He would pick up a career-high 6 interceptions in 2020, as he would also record a pick 6 on the year as well. And alongside all that, like I said, this would be the lone season, the 2nd season that he had a Pro Bowl and first team All-Pro, the 2nd time he'd been named to a Pro Bowl, and the 3rd time he had been named one of the best, or he had been named to the first team All-NFL. Following that 2020 season, the Kansas City Chiefs would end up beating the Browns in the divisional playoff round to make it to the AFC Championship. They would go on to beat Josh Allen and the Bills by 2 touchdowns to make it to Super Bowl 55 in Tampa. And then in Super Bowl 55, they would end up losing to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So that would see them fall short. But of course, this would transition into Tyrann Mathieu's last full season in this league, his 9th season and his 3rd season with the Kansas City Chiefs. In the 2021 season, the season that was just finished, he would go on to start all 16 of the games he played in the first season that the NFL expanded its season to 17 games for every year. In that season, in the 16 games he played, he finished with 76 tackles for a Kansas City Chiefs team that went 12-5 and won the AFC West for the 6th year in a row. Alongside Tyrann Mathieu's 76 tackles, which of course was the 5th time in the last 7 years that he's had at least 75 by that metric. And then he would go on to finish with 2 tackles for loss. He finished with a sack last year. He had 3 fumble recoveries, and he would go on to finish with 3 interceptions, including a touchdown. Just him having a hand in almost every single defensive play would result to him being named a Pro Bowler last year for the 3rd time in his NFL career. And then once the season would come to a close, the Chiefs would go on to beat the Steelers in the wild card round to make it to the division round. They would beat the Bills off of some overtime heroics to make it to the AFC Championship game, and they would lose off of a field goal to the Bengals after the Chiefs already had a chance to take the lead. The Bengals would drive down the field, and then they would go on to win this game. That was the last time, of course, Tyrann Mathieu had laced it up for the Kansas City Chiefs. Being from New Orleans and from Louisiana, like people forget he's from LSU, he went on to sign a 3-year contract worth $33 million with the New Orleans Saints on May 4th, which is just over a week ago. But with that said, Tyrann Mathieu is now a member of his hometown team, the New Orleans Saints. Being a Falcons fan, I mean, it's tough to hear, but I mean, at the same time, him going home, it's a good story, and I can't wait to see what he does in front of his hometown fans. With that said, I want to thank everyone that's been listening to all 15, 16 minutes of this piece. I do hope all is well. I want to thank the college and pro football reference websites for giving me all the facts and figures, because without them, I would not be able to do this. And like I said, once all of today's exhibitions and matchups are done, I am going to come back tomorrow on Saturday, May 14th for another episode. But I do have an individual profile immediately after this. But with that said, thanks for listening. I hope all is well. Thanks to the websites for helping me out. If you ever get a chance to watch Tyrann Mathieu, he's wearing number 32 for the Saints, and he should be a really solid option for that team as the Saints look to make a playoff push. With that said, thanks for listening. I hope all is well, and I'll catch you with more tomorrow. Thanks for listening to my piece. I'm James Sims, and this is The Elite. Peace out.